be boring in the next 12 weeks.
And I'm Amrita, and I will be popping in and out.
Okay. We can go this way and introduce ourselves quickly.
Hello, I'm Jean-Paul.
Sepide. Karen.
I'm Omar. Bolisani.
Maria.
Lisa. Sarah. Shannon.
And there is one person who should be on the way and 3 people stuck in some visa office still arriving. But we'll have to go on, and they'll have to catch up. For people here, let me say that Maria here is going to be taking you for the last session in terms of art in Africa. And Mongisen is going to be taking you for poetry, orality, literacy, South African forms of performance. Omar will be dealing with photography. And Karen will be dealing with everything. Amrita will be dealing with everything. And Amrita is about to also go to Europe and perform. I think it's the first time I've heard of it, her PhD being turned into a play. So we'll be performing and acting in it as well. So that's, yeah.
Not swimming. You're not doing any swimming.
Swimming.
Yeah. Oh, Olympics. Olympics.
Not yet, Omar.
So this is an experimental first, in a sense, because we never brought sociologists and artists and performers together to construct with a common language and a course. I will say first a few general things and then invite people to say what they intend to be doing. And then I will start speaking about the relationship between sociology and the arts and the difficulties in putting these things together. And then I will have to lurch into the introduction for the first seminar, which is much more about the voice, the word, poetry, society and social movements. And then we start running the course. And you will see that a lot of the readings will start being uploaded at this, on Vula. Some of the things will be given to you to take with you. And what we are doing there with the readings is again constructing bibliographies and pulling things together, and their suggestions. What you need to do is to define what you want to do as a project. In other words, not only what you want to do conceptually, but what genre, what type of activity interests you most. I know from some of you what you intend doing, but once you've identified the kind of project that will haunt you for the next 6 months, then we can start adding bibliographies and things and further readings. Okay. Now, Amrita, do you want to say anything at this stage? Okay, well, everybody has got now the preliminary reading lists. We've uploaded that on Vula. Okay. Now, unfortunately, the sociological imagination stops short and marks a retreat when asked to provide any insight on the works of the imagination. It's peculiar because, as we know, symbolic, performative, oral, scripted, digital forms, the narrative, the allegory, the parable are so central to our lives and to people's lives and our everyday lives. It is surprising that sociology has so little to say about it. And when it comes to comments on the creativity of the non-West, such an imagination becomes remarkably Eurocentric. We need to look no further than Max Weber, the sociologist, the founder in his rational foundations of Western music, where he's got a powerful discussion about how the orchestral, the symphonic emerge. And it becomes disempowering when he looks at non-Western forms, musical forms, where he calls them the non-rational conglomeration of successive and random semitones. And we can analyze that in depth here if we want to. The rest, in other words, should be left to ethnography and anthropology as opposed to proper sociology and proper studies of modernity. And there is a sense of disregard too in the works of cultural and literary synthesis, and you come from the arts and so on. If you take Erich Auerbach's fantastic synthesis of the representation of reality in Western literature, or Harold Bloom's The Western Canon, which are exported to the peripheries as arch texts of understanding literary and creative modernity, if the periphery is ever the correct word, it can only become a study then of mimicry and westernization. In other words, a study of artists who may or do have some presence, or pretend to have some presence in the canon, versus the rest involved in ethnoscapes, ethnophilosophies. So, now, again, the Frankfurt School and neo-Marxists have tried to link sociology to the aesthetic. And they are, I don't know, from Adorno to Jürgen Habermas in the Frankfurt School. And they insisted that the creative fields cannot be easily reduced to social structure and social relations. And, you know, Adorno, for instance, in his passionate accounts of understanding the work of art as art, be it music, be it the poetry or the novel, is very important, admittedly. Also Pierre Bourdieu, and there are some readings that are going to be given to you of Bourdieu, his critique of taste and the production of taste and his attempts to explicate the emergence of the autonomous field of art and the literary are also important. Fine. But they're woefully Eurocentric. They're woefully ignorant of what is happening in the rest of the world. And they echo, at their worst moments, what Weber has just done to music. Right, so, but Bourdieu asks quite stridently, in a book called The Rules of Art, what makes a work of art and not a mundane thing or a simple utensil? What makes an artist as opposed to a craftsman or a Sunday painter, of course? What makes a urinal or a bottle rack that is exhibited in a museum into a work of art? So, in his powerful assessment of distinctions, which is a social critique of the judgment of taste, he argues that the eye is a product of history that's reproduced by education. By implication, this pure gaze is a historical invention linked to the emergence of an autonomous field of art that is, and I'm quoting, a field capable of imposing its own norms on both the production and the consumption of its products. So, in other words, instead of aesthetic taste, Bourdieu identifies a form of symbolic violence. He argues that distinction is a power of a class fraction, aesthetic elites, to differentiate themselves from others. And it all depends on the historical cultivation of cultural competencies. Groups come to possess what he calls dispositions. And through them, programs of perception, big words, dispositions, programs of perception that allow us to pass judgments on taste, classifying ourselves as cultured, distancing ourselves from necessity or from the vulgar, and through that, colonize behavior and feeling. That's his assessment of. So he castigates, in a sense, aesthetic gatekeepers, the people of the pure gaze. And he insists that it's only a sociologically scientific analysis that can intensify literary experience instead of this pure gaze and this aesthetic judgment. So, in other words, he's really asking sociology to do a sociology of the arts. But he shares with Adorno a vision of the underclasses, the working class and popular culture that is rather problematic. To quote, "It must never be forgotten that the working class aesthetic," argues, "is a dominated aesthetic, which is constantly obliged to define itself in terms of the dominant aesthetics." End of quote. So for the dominant, the working class exists, he calls it a foil, as a foil, whose sole function in the system of aesthetic positions, I'm quoting, is to serve as a negative reference point in relation to which all aesthetics define themselves by successive negations. So such a distance which is produced in his language by the habitus, isn't it? You know, the habitus in Bourdieu is very important. Is a deep process. It creates a set of distinctive features, his words, about bearing, about posture, about presence, about diction, pronunciation, manners and usages, without which, in these markers at least, all scholastic knowledge is worth little or nothing. And no schooling can teach this fully. And they define the essence of bourgeois distinction in the West for him. So we're making sense in this. You know, that it's something that's deeply socialized. It's not, schools reinforce it, but it's deeply socialized by broader social structures. So he enjoys the drama and he relishes in it that this involves. To quote again, "The nature against which culture is here constructed is nothing other than what is popular, low, vulgar, common. This means that anyone who wants to succeed in life must pay for his accession, her accession, to everything that defines truly humane humans by a change of nature, a social promotion, a process of civilization, a leap from nature to culture, from the animal to the human. But having internalized the class struggle, which is at the very heart of culture, he is condemned to shame, horror, even hatred of his language, his body, his tastes, and everything he was bound to, his roots, his family, his peers, sometimes even his mother tongue, from which he is now separated by a frontier more absolute than any taboo." So he's describing this sense, you know, once you've joined the world of distinctions by hook by crook, there is a shame that comes with it, and this distancing from those vulgar common pasts you came from. The alternative is to adjust their expectations to their chances, defining themselves as the established order defines them, reproducing in their verdict on themselves the verdict the economy pronounces on them, and so on. So people either have to conform, be modest, be humble, be uncivilized, be vulgar, be whatever, and so on, and continue like that. For reasons that will become obvious sooner than later, we cannot entertain fully this dialectic of resentment and adjustment that he is talking about. And it's traits that he shares with Adorno, to see subaltern people and classes as dramatic adjusters of a system of domination. Furthermore, we cannot remain within the cultural spaces of France or the West if we are to decipher something of sociological significance. There's been a habit in a lot of the fantastic critical work that's been done by sociologists and social theorists who look at the canon and redefine it now, in a sense by taking different takes on it depending on a philosophical framework. So you will see that Georg Lukács, in his aesthetic theory, prefers Thomas Mann. Adorno prefers Kafka. And later Beckett. Sartre and Bourdieu prefer Flaubert, and so on. In other words, different takes on the canon. The canon is the canon. Depends on your philosophy, what is profigured or subverted. There have been attempts to create a sociology of art, but like Vera Zolberg, I prescribed it there on a construction of sociology of the arts. She points to the difficulty of any sociology. She points to the fact of over-socializing it. You know, you have to arrive at a situation where art makes itself. You know, because the author doesn't matter, you know, the biography doesn't matter, and so on. Too much social structure makes things disappear. And she looks at audiences and she does some very interesting things, but she reproduces in that book exactly what Weber and others are saying about the rest. So we're not only interested in how literature, music, art and performance interact with society. Our concern is about the relationship between changes in aesthetic work and societal change. Furthermore, on how social movements and profound events during social upheavals transfigure the arts, and how processes are deeply entangled on a planetary scale. Now, we could have started our story earlier in the entanglements that occurred during the foraging by a number of European powers since the 16th and the 17th centuries to make a related point. How this, you could have in the 17th century a piano playing and composing emperor in China sponsoring an orchestra made of eunuchs with white wigs performing Western compositions and also his compositions in the Forbidden City, or have Ignatius Sancho in Britain, a freed slave, who's composing music from the emerging bourgeoisie in England, or as guitars at the same time are being traded via Angola to the Lunda in the Congo in exchange for ivory. Or we could be looking at the arts and songs of slave rebellions and how pirate shanties combined with sailors' shanties, and you know, in Madagascar, and looking at the earth-shattering events of genocide, revolutions, the American, the French, the Haitian, and looking at emergent forms and how they survive over time. But we chose the 19th century to now in this one. We could have done that. It would have been very interesting. But what I want to operate with, me and then others can add, is a series of concepts. One is aesthetic constellation. The other one is concept of the international of the imagination. The other one is concept of social movements. The other one is aesthetic acuities. The other one is the radical impulse. Words. First concept, aesthetic constellation, comes from Adorno's work. And he borrowed it from Walter Benjamin. By aesthetic constellation, we're talking about the formal and unformed elements and bits that constitute an artist's universe of creativity that allow her, him, her to navigate her, his art or craft. An artist may be in the confluence of many such constellations. What I mean by this is that, like, you know, it's many things. It's not just something that is rational, whole, and so on. It's quite a diverse thing. Now, I would also like to comprehend such an idea in its broadest sense in all contexts, avoiding distinctions of taste like Bourdieu, of high and low, elite or popular, devotional, social or political, or purely commercial. Yes, there are aesthetic dominance, process of inclusion and exclusion, canonized individuals, canonical works, aesthetic gatekeepers, classifiers and power investments and dynamics. Sometimes aesthetic constellations of some kind become dominant, canonized, and often not. So, for example, an ensemble of us could be sitting in Johannesburg in the 1970s and listening to Cecil Taylor, who is an avant-garde jazz pianist from Chicago. And let us say, for me, for example, we're playing the church organ in the afternoon and find myself down a drinking hole in the evening where me and my buddies gather with guitars and sing. And late at night, I might be settling down and composing music. So, and I could be, my real job might be as Julius Malema's speechwriter. Okay, that's where the bucks come. Okay. So I might be going through an intense period of compositional creativity or not. So in a sense, what I'm trying to get with aesthetic constellation is that ensembles, individuals, both belong and imagine to belong to constellations, or being told they belong to constellations. And I'm looking at constellation as a concept that's slightly looser than ideology. Of course, there are ideological bits in it. There's things that are wrong or right. And you discover what a constellation is, and we can do this exercise if you draw, if you're creative, a map of whom you start excluding from what your creativity is. And sit there, you can spend hours trying to imagine where you are. Because it's not just simple, I'm a jazz musician. It's much more complex than that. But whom do you exclude will start telling you where you belong in that way. And then when the concept of aesthetic acuity, these distinctions of high and low, the distinction of those who possess the ability to distinguish the pure and the vulgar, the authentic and the inauthentic, the good and the bad art, and so on, are about the hierarchical structure of society and not about aesthetic acuity. In other words, as opposed to Bourdieu's as pure aesthetic gaze, I'm saying there are aesthetic acuities. Put differently, the construction of aesthetic dominance and the canonization of some works and not others is less about aesthetics as such, but the monopolization of value by aesthetic status groups. This is shared from London to Beijing. Now, so aesthetic acuity is the combination of sensibilities that accrue in a person, we're individualizing it now, by virtue of her occupying a particular constellation. Okay? Each of which are constituted by specific symbols, signifiers. We can theoretically elaborate this. So, if you are serious, in terms, some of us are tainted by the pure gaze and by us needing to distinguish good and bad, white or black, and so on. But most creative people are open to the vulgar, and they're open to things they encounter, and they make sense symbolically. So if you're serious and open to a lot of things, and there is no innovation without it. So instead of cultivating class, caste, or race bigotry, those are the gates of the profound, better understand how these acuities work. So, all artists, writers, composers, photographers have senses open to multiple figurations. Local, national, international. It's about relative degrees of openness and closures. That's what it involves. Whether your socialization closes you, fine, but music travels across boundaries. Some music irritates, some music draws you in, and so this concept is basically an attempt, tried to argue before in this book, The Ethic of Reconciliation, is what kind of sensibility that develops in the arts and artistic groups, that is a consequence of art and artistic practice, or listening, or being close to creative work. Whether you're a reader, or whether you're a writer, and increasingly since the Second World War, a refusal to deal with the human abstract in the arts has helped a lot. And you see a lot of sensibilities, since the 1970s primarily, that are much more open to others, other civilizational constellations, other cultures, others out there. And as I made it into a cliche in The Ethic of Reconciliation, after reading Marquez, who has read Marquez? Gabriel Garcia Marquez. It's difficult to bomb Macondo, the fictional village he creates. You start understanding that, hey, there's something happening out there. Now, I say this because people come back to me and say, no, but the international imagination has always been there, and so on and so forth. Please go and read D'Annunzio's most famous Italian poet, his Tiene te Africa, or read Kazantzakis' The Odyssey, and look at how Africa is scripted in that one, and you'll freak out. There is the icon of Italian poetry writing these things in the 1930s and 1940s. In Kazantzakis' Odyssey, the longest poem ever written. And he even wrote plays about the emancipation of the Negro races. But read what he's saying there, and it's not that sensibility. So this, in other words, there is an international imagination that slowly builds up, builds up, builds up through the work of the arts. And it's about the imagination. And the radical impulse is a concept that Sumangala Damodaran from India, who's going to be taking this in October, where she's trying to understand how it was that a profound cultural movement in India emerged of writers, performers, dramatists, and composers as a consequence of the emergence of crisscrossing people's and working class movements against the Raj. And a movement that was intensively national, but infused by a real and imagined internationalism. So they were a mixed bag of artists. At first ones as much, art first ones as much as struggle first ones. And belonging to different constellations with competing acuities, to use the jargon, who were responding to social upheavals. So for my part of the course, I'm working, in other words, with the hypothesis, which links those things. I argue that at times of social ferment and during the rise of social movements, artists with a variety of acuities who belong to a variety of aesthetic constellations are caught up in the maelstrom of a radical impulse, which creates contexts that intensifies their work. Social movement literature tells us that that movements are sustained upsurges of people that challenge the power structures and the norms of society. And as such, artists are not only parts of the sustenance, part of the moral formation that movements bring, but creative transformations in the way art happens reconfigures their work. So out of these, new constellations emerge. And some ossify and become dominant, some die, some define the opposite of the collective, the extreme individual. But all these things are somehow related. So in the context of popular struggles, the idea of the people is important as a legitimate subject of freedom, emancipation, and so on. It unleashes a tension between artistic praxis and dominance, and so on and so forth. So, basically, we're looking for these interrelations in the stuff I'm going to be dealing with. And I'll be doing it quite practically through works. But we also need some more sociological things before we can do this properly. So, there have to be some concepts where I understand creativity and how it happens. And I put it to you, if we take any society, performance happens through multiple sites, and within formal and informal context of facilitation. So, as I alluded to, from the street venue down the road to the temple nearby, and perhaps even the stadium, things happen. So in a single day, as somebody moves from being a teacher of Vivaldi in the morning and a choir master or mistress at night, and so on, all kinds of things happen. Not only do we need a social map of such sites where things happen, but also we need to understand that each one would have facilitator coordinators, each one has rhythmics and cycles. If you take temples, you have cycles, activity around them, rituals, performers, people who make visual things, and so on and so forth. You know, so, and those are the rhythms, and one has, they have the inner logic, whether the devotional is primary, whether the political is primary, whether the commercial is primary, whether the this is primary or that is primary, they all exist. So around them is wrapped a social ecology that produces and nurtures talent, from the guitar tutor to the master guru, to the instrument makers, the printers, the journals, the whatever you want to call it. And we need a map of all these sites, not as a hierarchy, but as a series of activities. And here, for instance, that's where we as aesthetic keepers start saying, good art only happens here, or here, or irrelevant art happens there, or bourgeois nonsense happens here, or this and that happens here. But what is sociological about this is that all these things are also interrelated. So in other words, I'm asking for a proper mapping of what is going on, understanding what the ecology that produces the talent is all about. How is it that there are so many Maskanda guitarists, and how they're being produced? You know, it's not, there's no school. You know, so it's what is going on here. So so in a sense, this social mapping will help us in understanding dynamics of change. It is obvious that certain choral forms in South Africa were the products of a single-sex hostile system. The talent was nurtured that through the cruel experience of the proletarian black life in migrant labor. That's how it happened. Now, if you understand the social ecology of all that, then you need to do something if you're going to change the hostels, and if you're going to change the migrant labor system, if you want to keep the choral forms. Okay, you know, so unless you understand the social ecologies of what nurtures talent and the powers that are being exercised, we won't get anywhere. Furthermore, we need concepts of power. It's not just sites, there's powers. So there are differentiations. What we think, let's say as poets, that aesthetic dominance are not necessarily what gatekeepers think are aesthetic dominance, and it's not necessarily the same as what state power or social power says it's dominant. Let's call it the process of canonization. Those who are elevated, put into the school curriculum, who are given prizes, who are by the state, and so on, and a specific breed. Canonization. Then if you take the others, so for instance, you can have the example of Coetzee here, where he's, by aesthetic gatekeepers, national and international, is the main O, isn't he? Is aesthetically powerful and so on, and something to emulate it. In terms of the state, is not canonized in any way. In the university system, he is. In terms of black writers, he might or might not be. We don't know. But there are these processes which things are elevated, and so on, which create, and that's where Bourdieu is useful, specific fields, autonomous fields, competition, tensions, movements within art, not necessarily movements in society. So we are, I remember the post-1976, if you were a poet, so where do you have to have your long jacket, your beanie, this, and just hang around looking heavy. So that's the second thing, is that it's the hierarchies of art. What becomes dominant, what is canonized, what's excluded, what's included. There's dynamics here. And there's dynamics within the fields themselves. You all of a sudden write a love poem in the Inanda Workers' Cultural Local, and you say, excluded. Okay, because this is, or theater has to be serious, was the argument, right? It can't be kind of a vaudeville comedy and so on. All those plays by Kente and by others are out, not on. So there's all these distinctions, discriminations that define the field. So the third thing, sociological thingy that is necessary for our exploration is about what happens when things move from site to site. What happens when a poet now is asked to face 100,000 people in a stadium? What happens when a poet imagines that she might be called to face 100,000 people in a stadium? Or when, what happens when a church choir that used to be a church choir comes onto the union platform? What happens to a craft person when all of a sudden her work is in the Guggenheim? What happens to all things when they move? And what happens to not only society, but the forms themselves? So anyway, so over and above my second hypothesis, the creation of aesthetic acuities among creative artists, what emerges through these moments of upheaval are new, let's call it artistic cadences. What would be the correct expression? No, the Latin version, but it would be cadence. Okay, fine. That define the landscape of political feeling, and it's about the politics of emotion. Always in serious tension with market forces. And the third one is that the movement activity in its crescendos deliver constructions of visual, acoustic, or literary archetypes for the next generation. A language of the optic, for instance, and we'll come to that through Russian and Soviet art. A repertoire of performance idioms. All kinds of things that are invented as transformations, and then they become idioms that are being imitated. Brechtian theater, as opposed to this theatre, oral theatre as opposed to that theatre. So these become stereotypes, then some of them become canonized, and so on and so forth. So, we will come to all these later. So I will stop now and say what I will be doing is exploring these themes through looking at poetry and the voice. Then it will be the turn of the drama people. Oh, sorry, then it's, okay, you will come in then and do what?
Well, I'll be picking up on what you will be doing with looking at more detail at some of the moments in which things have happened in the development of oral poetry in South Africa. And so we'll look at, very much in line with what Ari is going to be doing, looking at very briefly some of the history of praise poetic forms in the Zulu language, and how these forms then get picked up in the 1970s and 1980s in the trade union movement, in political funerals and places like that. And so we'll be adding a bit of detail to what Ari is going to explore up front.
And then it's going to be performance. Do you want to say something now?
Sure. I mean, one of the things that we would be exploring, by we, I mean Mark Fleischman and Jay Beza, he's also going to be joining us. What we're trying to look at is what happens when performance moves from enclosed spaces to outside on the streets, or to spaces that we don't usually imagine performances would be taking place. What happens when the audience, who's used to hiding in amongst the audience and sitting on a seat quietly, what happens when she is not a passive observer anymore, and she's put under the spotlight and she's asked to be part of the so-called interactive theatre? What happens when we try and take this interaction to one step forward and make it more like a social intervention? So Mark is going to be talking about his current projects that he's doing right now, and what kind of challenges that one faces when you try and move theatre from enclosed spaces and from conventional norms to a social intervention. And one of the things that I want to explore, if there is time, is what happens when, as a social scientist, we are not just using theatre as a way to spread information. That's a very easy thing. So you use theatre to spread awareness, but instead of that, what happens when we use theatre as a method of research? What are the challenges that one can face? So these are some of the things that we will be exploring in the theatre part of it.
And then the visual comes in, and then we've got Omar, you're going to respond.
Yeah, no, at the moment, very, well, for a long time, very interested in the way power and race and how it affects production of images in this country, and how images are used in this in the way these two interact in the early part of the century, and looking at a number of photographers and the influences, and also the one of whom is in Germany at the time of the Bauhaus movement, and how that is translated into the South African landscape, and the way she frames the black other. And then looking at the issue, then the very complex issue of documentary sociology, or say anthropology, and agency in the way photography moves. But then they come to the 80s, basically, where photography by marginalized groups, part of the what we'd call the big, broad anti-apartheid movement, becomes at one level a dominant force in the country. And secondly, it also becomes a force in which finds and determines and shapes an audience in the 1980s. So, but then there are also there's a whole range of people like the David Goldblatts who say they are outside politics, but how one looks at the shaping of that worldview, and now how it becomes a very dominant international photographer. So we're looking at that broadly, the issue of race, power, and the new aesthetics, how people are represented and how others represent them as one level. But yeah, so we stop there.
Yeah, I'm looking at how visual artists in Africa responded to the struggle for independence, and then also in the post-colonial period, how that actually interacted with their work. What I'm doing is, firstly, I'm going to do a very broad kind of overview that's going to survey different case studies across Africa, looking a lot at the kind of strategies they used in terms of the visual language, or this is the constellations, the aesthetic constellations that they were actually working with, but relating that very much also to their notions of different senses of community, both at a very local level, at a national level, and also in terms of their notions of what constituted the international. And how a lot of these artists got caught up in quite complex post-colonial situations where often there was conflict, and where, as leading intellectuals of the time, they had quite they had quite a mixed reception, would be the quickest way to put it. But I want to follow that with the second seminar is going to look at one particular artist, just as a way of then dealing with those ideas in more detail, and that will be Malangatana from Mozambique. So also the time frames will be on one hand from the 50s through till really the 70s, 80s. Malangatana goes right through till 2011, but the focus will be more on the sort of independence periods.
So, and then there will be others. There will be focus on music. There will be focus on public art. There will be a whole range of discussions around those themes. Now, let me stop for a second. Does it make sense? What has been, let's open it up now, makes sense. What I really said is four things. Firstly, let's decolonize sociology. Secondly, it is possible to do a sociology of the arts and popular culture, but we need specific concepts sensitive to the fields we are dealing with. Thirdly, I outlined a series that might be right or wrong, the experimental concepts put out there that allow us to speak about the relationship with the social and the arts. And the fourth thing is that there is the hypothesis that there is a profound correlation between movements in society, whether they cause social change or not, and changes in form. Yeah, so that's what I said. Comments? Discussion? Before we get more practical. Should we get more practical? Okay, let's get more practical. And then we can break out in more workshop areas. Okay. Right. first encountered Mayakovsky in Johannesburg. He wasn't alive, no. You know, but it was part of the people you had to read for 2 years. Firstly, despite the fact that he had committed suicide or was playing Russian roulette over weeks and weeks and weeks because of his depression, what was happening to his art and his performances and his plays in the Soviet Union, killed himself. But 2 years later, Stalin canonized him after the request of his perhaps lover or not, or his muse, Lily Brick, canonized him as one of the most important Soviet poets of that generation. So basically, you know, so there he was in the underground of Johannesburg, being pushed by the left as a poet that has to be read. And secondly, because of his formalism and because of the way he did plays and cooperated with other artists, he survived as being taught marginally in drama departments. You know, so that's the reason we encountered him. But for me, he is very important in order to juxtapose him against the Pan-African poets, Césaire, or the Latin American poets like Neruda and others, because of a certain direction Soviet art took that is still influential to this day. Now, what you look at when you look at Mayakovsky is the intensity of his poetry. It's diabolically hyperbolic. It's very, very intense. You know, basically, at 22 years old, he already was influenced by certain things that we'll come to. But listen to this. Yeah, overfed lackeys make way. He says, you know, there is no single gray hair in my soul. Thundering through the world with the might of my voice, I go by handsome 22-year-old. So it's generational. It's about the world around him, overfed lackeys. It's before the Russian Revolution. So he wrote this poem, Cloud in Trousers. And there is love for a violin and a love for the crashing of drums. There is love in the vodka, the gin, but mine is pure, ecstatic lips. So, and I can be, if you wish, furious, flesh elemental, or changing the tones that the sunset inspires, if you like. I'll be fantastically gentle. Not a man, but a cloud in trousers. So that's his cloud in trousers thing. So, but the poem is about his woman friend coming in, telling him she's going to come in, and she comes late, very late, and he's freaking out by then, and he tells him it's over, and the whole poem is an explosion about this rejection, and it's very funny in parts, but very interesting in the way that he brings everything, the revolution, the need for revolution, the city, the poets, the workers, the peasants, everything is in revolt. And you know, just his imagery is just totally hyperbolic, and the elements of it are about modernity, what is modern and what is old and superstitious, and the people who believe in God and believe in the church, and the, you know, so there is this sense that he's ultra-modern, a celebration of machines. He celebrates the machine in England, and the telephones, and the electricity poles, and the whatever you want to say is a belief, total belief in that there could be a science of poetry, as much as there is a science of society. And then his belief that this revolution is his revolution. It's a personal issue. So he was quite a maverick when it came to this. So look at that poem, Cloud in Trousers, and just look how it goes. Wow, 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 wow. Everywhere, hyperbolically, loud hailer is shouting it out to the world. I'm in love and I've been jilted. You know, it's a social issue. So, and the heaven gets into trouble, and everyone gets into trouble in this. Now, the key thing we'll come back to Mayakovsky, to understand is the relationship between Moscow then